The other story this week that we want to talk about is what looks like the return of blasphemy laws to Europe. So Denmark, this happened late last week on Thursday, I believe. Denmark announced that it was passing a new law that is criminalising Quran burning. Now, it didn't explicitly say that you can't burn Qurans, but it did say that you were no longer allowed to improperly treat the books or texts that were sacred to religions. So obviously that includes the Quran, it includes the Bible, it includes all sorts of other holy texts. And it was also very obvious that Denmark passed this law with the Quran in mind. We've seen recently in Scandinavia, in general, a lot of cases where far-right groups, but also apostates, ex-Muslims, have been burning Qurans to make a political point. Tom, what have you made of this? Is this a massive setback for free speech in Denmark?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think it's a really depressing chapter in the story of the attempt to effectively kind of globalise Islamic blasphemy laws. I think this is something that kind of came and went without much discussion, apart from on places like Spikes, but is really, really central. So as you say, this is a thinly veiled Quran burning bill, effectively. It's now been signed into law. No one is really even pretending this isn't about anything but Quran burning. Even government officials in the Danish coalition government have said we are putting a stop to Quran burnings on social media. I thought there was a really striking quote that came from one of the spokespeople for the Moderate Party, who were part of the coalition there, who said, "This is a law that we're passing not out of desire but out of necessity." And that is such a tremendously depressing and revealing statement. So obviously the context here, not only have these Quran burnings taken place, but also as a consequence, both in Denmark and Sweden, you've seen the terror threat level rising precipitously. They've also had a lot of pushback from the leaders of Muslim majority countries. In Iran, both the Danish and the Swedish kind of diplomats were summoned in for a dressing down. In Iraq, I believe both of their embassies were stormed as a consequence of all of this. The OIC, I should say, which is the Organisation of Islamic Countries, has been essentially pushing for something to be done about these Scandinavian countries. And this is just a bold capitulation to those demands. It's a tearing up of hard-won Danish freedoms because theocrats elsewhere in the world, or terrorists within their own country, have decided that they're upset about people mocking what it is that they happen to believe, or not showing due respect to a text that they happen to hold to. So I think it's really difficult not to see this as anything other than a really kind of stark chapter in the decades-long process. We might get into how long this story is, of the attempt to take Islamic blasphemy laws and effectively impose them by any means necessary. What I think we're seeing here is the shift from that being a kind of internalised thing. It doesn't do that, intense fear about blaspheming against this particular religion. The fact that it's now becoming kind of black and white letter law, I think is something new and particularly troubling in that sense. Mm.
I mean, what do you make of this, Dennis? I don't know if you saw this. I should also say that not only is it now a crime to burn a Quran or religious text, but it also can be punished by a fine or up to 2 years in prison. So you could go to jail for up to 2 years for improperly treating a Quran in Denmark. So what have you made of this, Dennis?
I guess speaking with my legal hat on rather than the sort of gay rights hat, I find it extraordinary. One, I question the degree to which this is compliant with a human rights framework. I don't see how this fits with relatively well-known freedom of expression cases. It certainly wouldn't fit with British common law conceptions of freedom of speech. And I think of Lord Justice Sedley and DPP and Redmond Bate saying, free speech includes the heretical, the obnoxious, and freedom of speech that doesn't offend people is not a freedom worth having. So I question the longevity of the law for that reason. I wonder to what degree that's going to be coherent with wider human rights obligations. That makes me in turn question why on earth a parliament would place itself potentially at risk of a declaration of incompatibility. I can only think that they may have considered it a short-term measure and end up with a few test cases. If that is the position, it's a very strange road to take, particularly if one looks at the jurisprudential history of Denmark, which abolished its last blasphemy laws, quite a few years back. So it is, I think, correct to characterise it in the first place as a blasphemy law. But in the second place, I just wonder the degree to which that's actually viable, because I get the point about capitulation to other countries. But, just as in the same way in the, say, immigration debate, people moan from the right generally, we can't do anything because the human rights framework. Well, that framework is going to kick in here at some point. So just legally speaking, I wonder what the position here is.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting as well just how often the kind of human rights framework has sort of failed in attempts to sort of defend freedom of speech, apart from in certain terms. I mean, it's interesting. I imagine the defence that's going to be made here, and there could well be slightly less full-fat versions of this law in Sweden, where they've had similar kind of spate of Quran burnings, and also some of their citizens have been killed in a terrorist attack recently in Brussels, where the terrorist in question explicitly targeted them on the basis that they was Swedish. So we might see something similar here, but it seems like they're going to go down this kind of national security route, effectively, that allowing, whether it's far-right agitators, whether it's anyone to do this, is in itself poses a kind of national security threat. So as we've seen time and again, sometimes these things can often count against any kind of meaningful pushback on the legal level. But I think it's a sort of reminder that we have to fight these things out on the moral level as well, and that's where we've really been slipping, because this is not an alien problem to a place like the United Kingdom. I mean, we don't have blasphemy laws of the kind that have just been ushered in Denmark. But if you think about Batley Grammar, if you think about the teacher there, still in hiding as a consequence of showing Muhammad cartoons to his students in a religious studies class about blasphemy, perfectly normal place to which to discuss that kind of material. And if you think also about what happened in Wakefield not too long ago, where that autistic schoolboy was expelled, subject to death threats, and his mother then had to go on a kind of apology tour around the local mosque as a consequence of him bringing a Quran into school and it getting knocked to the floor and being lightly scuffed. So we're very much in that stage of these things are not institutionalized in quite the way, but they are kind of already internalized in terms of how we deal with these things, that you almost don't need the law. But I think there is something still very symbolically significant about the fact that this is actually something that has now reached a statute in a Western country, and it being Denmark as well, given its kind of recent history from the Danish cartoons controversy in 2005, where there was, of course, a lot of equivocation amongst their cultural elites about that, the sort of thing that we saw in the UK with the Rushdie affair, people saying, well, they probably shouldn't have done that, or it's a bit unseemly or whatever. But nevertheless, the state resisted any attempts to properly criminalise what Illandsposten had done, through to, relatively soon after the Charlie Hebdo attack, of course, there was the shooting in Copenhagen at an event where there was a Swedish cartoonist who had drawn Muhammad and seemed to be part of the reason that it was targeted. So they have definitely become one of those nations who have become a kind of flashpoint in this kind of Islamist, this sort of global Islamist campaign against freedom of speech and so on. So to see them capitulate and to see them do it via introducing these laws just feels like it has a really grim symbolic significance, I think.
And Tom, don't you think this is particularly chilling that it happened so close to the sentencing around the Samuel Paty case that we've seen this week?
Yeah, so this is an interesting development in that. So obviously Samuel Paty, the teacher, was beheaded in France in 2020 by a Chechen Islamist. There was this ongoing case which is now resolved where basically a bunch of teenagers who had some involvement in this killing. Essentially, there's one young woman in particular who essentially started a rumour about him which spun out of control. Part of the reason that he ended up being targeted in the way that he was, she wasn't actually in class the day in which the cartoons were supposedly presented, but she claimed that he asked the Muslim pupils to identify themselves and then to leave the room. This is kind of part of the spiral of rumours that led to his death, as well as a number of young men, I believe, who have on the day itself seemed to be involved in basically telling the Islamist in question where he was, is that him? Have you seen him around? All that kind of thing, taking money for doing so. So they've been handed basically a bunch of suspended prison sentences as a consequence of that. But it's a real reminder about why you cannot allow this kind of medieval intolerance into your society, because it creates these kind of moments of hysteria in which basically gossip and half-truths can spin completely out of control and lead to someone to lose their life. It's the sort of thing you see happening in Pakistan all the time now, which has a real problem with not only does it have kind of blasphemy laws per se, but as a consequence of blasphemy being taken so seriously in that country, you very quickly have a lot of hate and violence being whipped up against individuals who, even if they've been falsely accused of blaspheming or of being heretics or what have you. And I think it is very important to note that when we talk about making sure that blasphemy laws don't make a comeback, whether informally or formally in this country, that is as much about protecting Muslim communities, it is about protecting the rest of British society, if you like. The only death that I'm aware of in the last 10 or 15 years in the UK as a consequence of blasphemy was an Ahmadi Muslim in Glasgow, a man called Asad Shah. People have kind of forgotten about this story. It's in 2016. There was a lot going on that year, but still. Because the Ahmadis are seen by many Muslims as essentially heretics. And as a consequence of this and videos he put out online, a man from Bradford went up there and essentially stomped him to death. So it's a reminder that these things, when they allow to get out of control, this attempt to kind of impose these sort of Islamic blasphemy laws, we should resist it as much for the minorities within minorities as it is for anyone else in British society. So I think that's really important to take heed of, particularly with the example of, ex-Muslims as well. So I think all of those people, liberal Muslims, ex-Muslims, members of dissenting sects, are as much in the firing line, if not more so, than the rest of British society or Danish society or whatever, when you allow these things to take hold. And I think that's important to remember when we talk about this issue.